I love it.
I would be down that way. It's beautiful. Good look.
So one of your red ball first
Do what?
one of your red ball first.
So when I teach Southern Lit, I always teach which is more. I've taught Love in the Ruins. This was years ago when we used to have literature class, and I taught that. Now the religion department teaches it. So
I saw he's saying, yeah, cover sheet. Yeah. So you hated that was something. Well, I mean, he was not. Yeah. Love was letters with Shelby. A Senate of distinguished Confederate Secretary of State. He was Secretary of War. He was not distinguished.
I have been tasked with A, calling us to order, and B, introducing Sue. Sue's been coming here to help us for over 2 decades, and we always look forward to it. We always learn a lot from it.
Well, thank you. Okay, so Guy told me that he showed you the Walker Percy video. Was it NPR? Voices and Visions? Do you even remember? That's the one I know. What did you learn, or what stood out for y'all? Just so you can. How dangerous do you think it is? I'm drinking a Coca-Cola at 7 o'clock at night. I told my little brother I would stay up and watch the opening statements of the Murdaugh trial tonight. So
there were a number of things that struck me. Maybe this will prompt others.
Okay.
The first thing that came to mind was Walker Percy lived a life of privilege.
Yes.
And we see a lot of that, of course, in this book too. But, so that was important. Then the upbringing in his uncle's home was well presented, I thought, and the influence that all of that had on him, and the contrast between his Uncle Willie and him was interesting. So yeah. Those were a couple of things that I would recall.
Good, and those are really good observations. He led such an interesting life, in the sense that, like you say, it's so interesting because on the one hand, he does grow up in privilege, and you can glean through the novel how learned he is, how well read, in classics and philosophy and that sort of thing. But at the same time, his life is sort of shaped by these initial tragedies of, the loss of his parents, which I think you can also hear echoes of in this novel in lots of places, and we'll talk about that a little bit tonight. Yeah, that's really good. Did the documentary talk about what he was trying to achieve as a writer? Or was it just more biographical? Okay, that's great. Well, tonight what I would like to do is just situate us in the novel moving forward. Who's reading it for the first time? Okay, let me ask you this. First impressions. Is the book shocking to you in terms of subject matter? Look at my old Presbyterians, never shocked by anything. I love it.
But it wasn't what I expected. It's certainly not a straight narrative by any means.
Good.
And it's a little bit more, it's odder than I thought it would be. It's a challenge.
It what?
It was unsettling.
Yeah, okay, so in this first little section, there's so much to establish and situate us in the actual novel. And there are things within this first section that I think help teach us how to read the rest of the novel. So let's talk about some of that, because everything you're saying is correct. It is unsettling. And there's so much that seems unreal about the novel, and yet totally recognizable and super real. So the first thing I want to talk about, because this is what I always talk about at the beginning with you all, is who's the narrator of this book? Tom. So every time you read a first-person narrative, a first-person narrator, you have to have little alarm bells going off in your head, because this is Tom telling his own story, yes? And in fancy talk, we call him a homodiegetic narrator. That's a first-person narrator who is in the story world, meaning he's not just a narrator, he's a character at the same time. And these are always the kinds of narrators you need to be cautious about, because can you tell who he's talking to? Who's he talking to in the book? Can you tell?
Feels like us.
It is. I mean, it breaks the wall and addresses you directly. Hey, reader. And first-person narrators are tricky because A, readers like first-person narrators, because we think we're getting somebody's scoop, right? And because they're speaking in the first person about their experience, there's almost this automatic intimacy between reader and narrator, but you have to be careful. Because the first thing you have to establish, which a lot of times takes a while, is what the narrator is trying to accomplish by telling this story. And if he's telling it directly to you, he knows there's a reader. So how is that going to temper or color what he says? Is he ever going to be a reliable narrator? Hank says no.
I don't think it's intentional.
It's impossible. I mean, he can't be objective.
Okay, good. And remember, okay, what does he do for a living?
Doctor.
Yeah. And because of where we are, or where he is in the novel, he's a psychiatrist by training, but at this point, he's also taking care of people's, ailments, physical ailments as well. And in the beginning of the novel, well, let's just focus on him for a few minutes. How does he see himself as a person in the world?
Well, he has a responsibility to his patients. When his nurse says, you've got patients at the office, he'll say, it's Saturday, I'm not supposed to be there. She said, you've got patients here, and he goes to see them.
Well, and she's the one who sort of controls the office. Why? What's he mostly doing? Drinking. So
Reading that history book.
right. And so immediately we have to go, okay,
and working on his invention.
Right. How reliable is he and how responsible is he really? Now, the nurse is thrilled because he has 3 actual paying customers in this first little section of the novel. So we begin to kind of learn things about him. Now, how else does he see himself?
Lapsed Catholic.
A lapsed Catholic. Meaning what?
He used to go to church and he, take part in the communion and eat Jesus. And he no longer really feels a strong enough faith connection to do that.
Okay, good. So if we look at the beginning, we've got 2 things that we have to kind of navigate in order to get into the bulk of the novel. One is, who is this person, Tom Moore, as he presents himself at the beginning? And what is the setting that he's working in? And what the heck is actually going on here, right? Because it's confusing, to say the least.
He's also a grieving father and a
Yes.
cuckold husband.
Yeah, and it gives you these very
Get the whole thing.
Whitman-esque catalogs of all of his problems, yes? All right, let's look. I'm just on page 1 because I want to set us up and sort of look at how he views himself. There is so much packed into this first little section, not just about Tom, but you have all of these references to and allusions about America as a country, as a republic. It also has, of course, all of these biblical references, but then you also have these sort of transcendental, I mean, there's just a ton in here. But he's also a psychiatrist. So you also have a lot of Freudian stuff in here. And then what later becomes, I don't care if you know this, Lacanian. Jacques Lacan was also this super famous psychoanalyst who starts writing, who's writing in the 50s. He's French. And there's some of that in here too. So Tom is learned, isn't he?
Yes.
Does he see himself as intelligent?
Yeah.
What does he see himself as?
An expert.
An expert. And what?
The savior, and he sees himself in a very grandiose way.
Yes.
As the savior of
Winning the Nobel Prize.
Yes. He sees himself winning the Nobel Prize. And he said in this kind of one-liner, and then it'll come up again, he sees himself as a genius. And y'all, this is super important, and we're going to get into that. Like, what is a genius anyway? Because that's something else hidden in the novel. So here's what he tells you at the very beginning. And this, the thing about Tom, and some of you have asked me, is if it's okay to crack up while you're reading this. Yes, it is. He's funny. Yes. And we like funny people too, generally, right? And so this is where you have to be careful, because do you see him as likable at the very beginning? Yes? Okay, you see him as strange. Well, he's got some ideas.
He tells us at one point that he thinks, looking at the totality of the circumstances, that he will be up there with Einstein and Newton in terms of what they've done for in the last 500 years of civilization.
Yeah.
Yeah, but sarcastic.
Yes.
Really?
I believe it.
I don't think he believes that about himself at all.
I don't. All right, we're going to talk about
I'm very crazy, John, you know that.
Go ahead.
I think that he is manic.
Yeah.
And he's kind of psychotic.
Yeah. Okay. I don't want to get off on this, but did any of you ever read Lolita? Lolita?
Did I did, oh my God.
So in that novel, which I don't want to get into, you have this kind of narrator who is first person in Lolita. It's a guy named Humbert, which of course is a fake name. And yet Tom Moore sounds real, right? And in Lolita, the narrator is hilariously funny and self-deprecating. And over again, he tells the audience, the reader, who he's directly addressing, that, you know, there is a chance he's a total psycho. And yet, most of you know at least enough about Lolita to know that this is a book about a child rapist. And yet, at the end of the novel, most people feel bad because they really liked Humbert, even though he's completely unreliable and yet seemingly straightforward. So working the narrator is important in any novel, but this one is difficult because I don't know if he really believes what he's saying about himself or if he is kind of playing in self-parody. So let's look at some of the things he says. So he begins with such a great line, and we looked at this last time. Now in these dread latter days of the old violent beloved USA. So the beginning sentence is apocalyptic, yes? But it also sounds biblical almost, doesn't it? And so immediately you start seeing these or hearing these echoes of Revelation, the last days, right? And he puts you there, and then he explains that in a couple of hours, he'll know one way or another if things are okay. But look at the second paragraph. 2 more hours should tell the story one way or the other. Either I am right and a catastrophe will occur, or it won't, and I'm crazy. In either case, the outlook is not so good. So in the beginning, he keeps giving you these oppositions. So he's going to tell you either he's right or he's crazy. And the position you take as a reader, in some ways, is going to determine what you get out of the novel in terms of the messages that Percy's trying to communicate about the world that you're inhabiting. So not only is there this impending doom, maybe, but he's drinking. He's broken out into hives. And he starts describing this space. Then he ends, I'm on this first page, I don't know where, you know. And he goes here. Is it that God has at least removed his blessing from the USA? And what we feel now is just the clank of the old historical machinery, the sudden jerking ahead of the roller coaster cars as the chain catches hold and carries us back into history with its ordinary catastrophe, carries us out and up toward the brink from that felicitous and privileged sighting where even unbelievers admitted that if it was not God who blessed the USA, then at least some great good luck had befallen us, and that now the blessing or the luck is over. The machinery clanks, the chain catches hold, and the cars jerk forward. That's beautiful writing.
That's Kierkegaard.
And what is he saying?
That the way history works and the way we live in history, looking backwards and forward. That's a quote from Kierkegaard.
There's a lot going on in this quote, right? So let's start with, because one way of reading this book is by thinking about the relationship between God and humans, but even here, more specifically, God and America. And Percy does this, I think, pretty brilliantly, because he's starting with this given. Do we all agree that at one point, God had chosen America for something? Do we all agree?
No.
Oh, look at this.
I mean, manifest destiny, bright shining city on a hill.
Yeah.
Part of our national narrative.
Yes, very good. It's part of our national narrative.
American exceptionalism.
Yes.
Or myth.
Yes. And depending on, so this is why I love Percy, because he will make your head pop off if you really start thinking too deeply, which he thinks is part of the problem, that we don't do that anymore. So this idea of God blessing the USA and the way in which we have historically predicated our identity as a nation on not just our reverence for God, but the way in which he has blessed us as a nation, unlike others. And you go, okay, so where does this all come from? And I guess we can go all the way back, if you want, to the Pilgrims and then the Puritans, who did. Winthrop is the one who says, right, that this is our great experiment. And if you look at the writings, this is so sad because I love the Puritans. If you look at the writing of the Puritans, they fundamentally believed America was the soil upon which the great religious war was going to take place between the devil, who's out in the wilderness, in the dark, in the woods, and the religious. And that, depending on our dedication, eventually God will win and good will rule. But then we get to the actual forming of the American Republic, which was not done by the Puritans. And all of the sort of seminal documents in American history that we revere and elevate, like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, was it written by Protestant Christians?
Or the deist.
Yes. Yes. Which are not our idea of typical Protestant Christianity. The Puritans would have had a stroke because the deists come out of progress, the idea that the idea of rationalism, that, you know, they believed in God, but felt that the universe was mechanistic. God sets it in motion and then steps back. Yes? That's not the same as the Puritans. The Puritans would have thrown the deists out. Yes? I mean, quite literally. And so we go, okay.
Religious out of the New England colleges.
Well, what the deists, and then, you know, as that moves forward, we go to the Unitarians and the Transcendentalists. They're trying to, okay, I know that, I hope you're not bored, because what I'm trying to show you is that from the beginning of the founding of the nation, we have this consistent sort of tension between that which is spiritual and that which is rational / empirical, scientific. And what do we do with that in terms of a national narrative, where we have this story that this is God's nation, that God does have his hand on America in a special way, which eventually leads to this whole manifest destiny that ramps up in the 19th century. Why am I saying all of this? Because is there some potential truth in this claim that God has taken away his hand, taken his hand off of America? It's really unsettling, yes? And what does that mean? And so we begin to kind of, even in the first page, get this sense that there's going to be this tension and sometimes collision of that which is spiritual versus that which is rational.
You know, this providentialism is deeply seated in Christian faith, and he goes to great length to tell you what a Catholic he really was. His heritage is Catholic, his parents are Catholic. So he has this, that's built in the soul of the Christian. God chooses nations. He chose Israel.
Yes.
So God plays favorites.
Well, we wrote the book on that, we Presbyterians.
Yes. Yes.
But it's deeply seated in the American consciousness on our.
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah.
The side we have to remember is that God chose Israel.
Yes.
When Israel got Northern Kingdom or Southern Kingdom, Assyrians or Babylonians, they paid for it. He said, I've had enough of you. You are too far away from what I called you to be. And he sent both the Northern and Southern Kingdoms into exile.
Absolutely. And so you get into some of these fundamental religious questions that most of us don't have the space or the time or maybe even the courage to delve into, certainly not on a regular basis. Yes? I mean, yes, God chooses Israel. Did God choose America? And then you go, as opposed to any other nation, or is there like a top 5, or, and it gets really hard, right? But at the same time, Tom is suggesting and sort of playing around with exactly the idea that you just raised, right? That, okay, well, something's gone wrong.
But he also, I mean, he kind of gives himself an out by saying either
God has taken us.
Yes.
Or we just ran out of luck.
Yeah.
Correct. And that's such, it philosophically, that is real scary. And what I mean is, so either we're chosen, which suggests some kind of teleological path towards something meaningful. Luck is what? Random.
Well, there's a third one.
What is it?
That we were chosen, but we've blown it.
Yes, good. And I think this is what Tom is trying to figure out. How did this happen? And this idea of the machine keeps coming back in this novel over and over and over again. And of course, if you kind of push into the novel, you think about the impact of the machine technology as it moves into the 19th and 20th century. And then in a minute, we'll get to Yeats because he's got that in here too. So he's explaining where he is and what his situation is. So we know, he says, I'm on page 5, these are bad times. So again, he's thinking in terms of times. And it sounds not just biblical, but he sort of seems to be thinking in terms of epics. Principalities and powers are everywhere victorious. Wickedness flourishes in high places.
Sounds like a prophet.
Yes. Yes. Very good. There is a clearer and more present danger, however, for I have reason to believe that within the next 2 hours, an unprecedented fallout of noxious particles will settle hereabouts and perhaps in other places as well. It is a catastrophe whose cause and effects and prevention are known only to me. The effects of the evil particles are psychic rather than physical. They do not burn the skin and rot the marrow. Rather, they do inflame and worsen the secret ills of the spirit and rive the very self from itself. So we have a narrator who says, everything's a mess. The world is a wasteland. I'm the only one who can fix this. I'm the only one who sort of gets it. And then your problem as a reader is, do you believe all of that? So what he tells you is that there are problems that are psychic rather than physical. There are secret ills of the spirit. Those aren't the same thing, are they? So rather than having physical problems, what kinds of problems do we have? Psychic, psychological, whatever. But do you think psychological ills are the same as spiritual ills? Are those the same thing? So you begin to sort of get this sense that this is someone, a scientist, which he tells you over and over again, who is thinking and focusing on the problems of the spirit and the problems of the mind. Now, do those things have to be, so you've got soul and mind, this sort of Cartesian split, right? And what are the problems? Can you identify them? What's happened?
He portrays himself as a quack.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You know, grandiosity of it and the quackery and, you know, the heavy sodium.
Yeah.
Chloride.
Yeah.
You know, it's pure quackery. And so that's the paradox. He's presenting himself as an expert and he looks like he's crazy.
Okay. What's wrong? Does he know his BS?
Yes.
I'll ask Dr. Dietrich. Does he know?
I sense that there's a satirical.
Yes.
Yeah, he's, you know, expanded.
Yes, and what you're 1,000% right. And that's what makes him such a hard narrator, because he's constantly making fun of himself. There's a lot of sort of catch-22 going on in here in terms of, you know, like, do you remember the moment where he says, well, I mostly pay my nurse to tell people I'm not there, which is major in catch-22. And the main character in catch-22 is Yossarian, who tells you right at the beginning, I'm totally insane, which makes me the sanest person here. And that's the problem with Tom. He does set himself up as this kind of drunken fool doctor, right? But then he tells you he's a genius who's made this machine. But when he starts talking about the problems of the spirit and the problems of the mind, he gets a lot of that right, it seems to me. Yes? And so, yeah, that's the problem with this narrator, because when is he self-revealing and when is he making you uncomfortable enough to go, yeah, this place is a mess. So for example, and we were talking a little bit about this before you came in, you know, this book comes out in 1971, and it's a futuristic, right, sort of dystopia. We're 50 years past this crazy, but the world he's describing, the America he's describing, seems awfully familiar to me. Not only the America coming out of the 60s, right, but the America and the culture war we are part of now, right? And this is why, and this is either satire works for you or you're just going, whatever. The thing about this book that I find so moving is Tom Moore does sort of get this split that he sees around him, that these sort of empty vessels where perhaps spirituality once lived, right? And he tells you, no matter how much he makes fun of himself and the church and the various churches, and tells you he's a lapsed, failed Catholic, he fundamentally believes in God. And he's not giving it up. So we have to figure out, how is this all going to go together? Okay, here's where he explains how, you know, the churches have all split. The Roman Catholics are scattered and demoralized. I, for example, am a Roman Catholic, albeit a bad one. I know so many Catholics that begin with that introduction. I believe in the Holy Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman Church, in God the Father, in the election of the Jews, in Jesus Christ, his Son, our Lord, who founded the church on Peter, his first vicar, which will last until the end of the world. It is this clear, declarative belief statement that we mostly don't get from him. Yes? And so we have to figure out as we move forward what that means, right? And it's sort of, I tell my students this all the time with that notion of the Christ-haunted South. Is this sort of a clear, demonstrative belief statement, or is he like me? He was born and raised Southern Baptist, and no matter what I do, that is in there. You know what I mean? It's in there. And so, what do you do with that, right? And he is saying, I don't know, y'all. This sentence is different from the other sentences around it, where he says, I stopped eating Christ in communion. It's not usually how we describe that.
But Catholics believe.
Oh, 100%. But usually when people talk about communion, it's very elevated, transubstantiation, blah, blah, blah. Well, he just stopped eating Christ in communion, stopped going to mass, and have since fallen into a disorderly life. I believe in God and the whole business, but I love women best. This is an important list. Music and science next. Whiskey next, God fourth, and my fellow man hardly at all. So that's very standard 18th century satire, Jonathan Swift kind of stuff, right? But God's fourth. It's a line, but how does the end of that paragraph match with the beginning of that paragraph? I mean, it's
It's an introspective line that I think is true. I hadn't finished the book.
Yeah.
I think it's
good self-recognition on his part.
It's the most interesting read. Got all that high-minded stuff at the beginning.
Yes.
It's very personal. This is kind of where I am.
Right.
I believe all that stuff.
You're exactly right. So is what seems to be complete, honest, ugly truth, let's be honest, on the list, God is number 4, right? I mean, it's like Brian Piccolo, right? That's a funny joke to me. Do you remember that book, I Am Third? Okay, this happens to me sometimes. That's really clever, actually. Look what he says. Generally, I do as I please. And this is a statement about authority, right? He does what he wants. But in doing what he wants, how can he possibly believe what he says he believes? Because it's not just a split within himself, but it's a split from God, yes? So this is problematic. Then he explains to you that what worries me most is that the catastrophe will overtake us before my article is published. Sadly, I get that. Because it's the academic position, right? That your identity depends on what you publish. The vanity of scientists. And he does this great sort of explanation of what scientists really are and who they're serving. And what he really wants is this. He has that moment where he dreams of his director giving him the Nobel Prize, that he's not just going to get, his article published, but he will win a Nobel Prize. And at the bottom of page 7. So I'm going to set something up here. If the truth be known, scientists are neither more nor less vain than other people. Right? They're just people. It is rather that their vanity is the more striking as it appears side by side with their well-known objectivity. That's the best, right? Can you be a scientist and a human at the same time? Because how can you be a scientist whose life is predicated on scientific reasoning and believe in God? That's a tough row to hoe.
I think all of us have some scientists. That's part of being a human.
Well, yeah, part of us have scientists in us, but we're not, most of us aren't scientists. Where you've dedicated your lives to this rational side. What do you do with what is irrational? I don't know, it's pretty good, right? Who's a scientist? Don't we have a doctor back there that's a scientist? It's a weird split, isn't it?
I don't know how you can be a psychiatrist.
Oh.
Get away with it, or that, Bill.
Well, this whole, I've spent 50 years in this. He captures also, we haven't figured out yet, are we going to work with machines? Or are we going to work with people?
Oh, yeah.
And we're still doing that now.
Oh my gosh, y'all. I cannot tell you. I might have told y'all this week, last week, the way people are flipping out about that AI chat. We have meetings. We're having another meeting on Friday. And it, to me, and you know, I'm a humanist, so I'm sitting there going, well, this is just sad. You know, that everybody's getting this worked up about the next machine that is not a human. And so with just the tiniest bit of common sense, you're going to be able to read something and go, that's not a human. That's not a 20-year-old kid who wrote that. You know what I'm saying? But it is wild. I mean, people are flipping out to ruin the academy, right? But you're right, we're still doing it. And part of what Walker Percy is recognizing, you know, post-World War II is this sort of postmodern age of technology that may be the ruin, or as a scientist, the salvation. But salvation is that a religious concept?
It's a Buddhist concept.
Right? Is it a physical concept?
The thing that's coming out is, think about it, the most important part of our reality sitting here is subjective experience, and it's something you can't measure.
Yeah.
And you can't figure it out by measuring electrons or electrochemical circuits. And so there is something about experience and subjective experience, which is not necessarily a rational thing that you can figure out rationally.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of room for spirit.
Right. Should be, yes? I could not agree with you more. I think what Tom Moore is suggesting is that when we get into the 20th century and now the 21st century, there may not be that many people who can get that. You know, what is the malaise people are suffering from? Give me some examples. What's wrong? What's happened in this world of the future?
You can't get anybody to fix your car when it breaks down.
Well, word.
Racial strife.
Okay, so this is huge. We know Walker Percy is writing this during maybe the sort of back end of the civil rights movement. But one of the things he emphasizes over and over and over again is this race thing. And one of the things that Walker Percy sees is the racial implications as they've impacted the American South, but also America as a whole. And, you know, so many African-American writers begin their sort of mantras. Langston Hughes said this, and then Obama repeats it. Okay, ready? The original sin of America. Says it in there, right? Yeah. The original sin was what?
Slavery.
Slavery. And y'all, that is such a loaded claim.
That's a religious faith. That's a hypothesis. That is not a statement of fact. I'm sorry.
Well, it's so problematic because it becomes this tangential part of a controlling narrative, right? And there's a lot you can say about what the institution of slavery does in this country. But most people who think about the institution of slavery or talk about it don't really have a clear sense of transatlantic slave trade that later becomes a domestic slave trade. And this is centuries in the process. And I don't know that talking about race and difference isn't an essential part of what America was and has become. Because if you're going to talk about racial disparity, you better go back to those Native Americans first, right? And look at the ways in which this idea of slavery matches up with nation building, building an economy, building a place. So
he is from the South.
yeah. Oh yeah.
Birmingham, Mississippi.
Louisiana, yeah. And listen, I think somebody could deliver very eloquent arguments about how slavery impacted that American identity dream, that narrative. At the same time, factually, it's a difficult statement. So, but it matters to Tom, and it matters in this book. So you have to keep it in the back of your mind. So you've got also all of these divisions of people into separate camps, yes? And you've got the far right, the far left. Any of this sound familiar? And they're enemies and they live in separate camps. And then you've got the people in the swamp. And who are those people?
Well, there's more than one of the Bantus, but also the college dropouts that are in there to, you know, go back to basic nature.
Yeah.
He's in love, leave us alone.
They beat him up.
Yeah. So you've got sort of these militant groups, and then all of the people who have dropped out, right?
And he names all these colleges that they've come
That's
from.
right. Yeah. But then we also have this world riddled by violence. And they talk about the inexplicable atrocities. This doesn't sound that futuristic to me, right? And so on the one hand, you know, Tom Moore is this very complicated character. And on the other hand, some of this is just right there. what do you think the world is worse now than it used to be?
Used to be when?
I don't know. You get to choose. My mother tells me this once a week. Yeah. It's all going to hell now. Lots of people think this, yes?
The global health and global wealth is much better now than it was.
Well, and I'm going to format McCarthy it and go, okay, name a time when you think everything was just dandy.
Never.
So, in some ways, what's going on here is pretty straightforward in terms of Tom is looking around and he is seeing not just a physical wasteland, which he can describe in vivid detail, but also the spiritual wasteland. And what he's seeing is, and Walker Percy does this in everything, is what he calls a malaise. And what is a malaise, y'all? I mean, what does that word mean?
Sort of lack of hope. Apathy.
Yeah, good. It's sort of this kind of static.
Summer afternoon.
Yeah.
Zaps your energy.
And
everything's too much trouble.
Yes, good. That's great. Because part of what he's suggesting, and watch now as you move forward, how, yes, it's futuristic. Yes, it's actually right now. But are the problems of the human spirit or the Christian spirit ever been particularly different? And he also mixes in some really good psychology, where he says, what I feel all the time is lack, or what does he say? No, it's not lack. He says, I feel longing.
Oh, yeah.
His heart's full of love.
But, some of this is just human, right? There's a lot of psychoanalytical theory from the past and the present that says the minute you are separated from your mother in the womb, your life is predicated on longing or lack. And we're always longing for something. Is God the answer? And he tells you from the time you're born, you're longing, and when you die, you're longing. Which is a pretty, I get it, but it makes me sad, right? Because in some ways, that's the position none of us want to be in or feel. So are we actively searching for ways in which to kind of mend that split between mind and soul or spirit? Or are we just watching time go by? Because it's a lot of work, y'all. For real, right? I mean, it truly is. Who has time? Seriously. I mean, I was telling my students this, we're doing Flannery O'Connor right now, and I was saying, here's the thing, 6 days a week, I'm in your face going, you need to be reasonable, you need to be rational, you need to have evidence for your arguments, you have to have concrete support for ideas. That's what an educated person does. But then on Sunday, I want you to believe in something supernatural. How does that work, right?
Not everyone is quite as dualistic as you're trained.
What do you mean?
Well, I think that is the Western mind.
Yes.
There's mind and spirit are here, and the body's here, and a lot of people soften that bridge.
Well,
and they don't feel schizophrenic, having a sense of spirit, an experiential life that is not predicated on scientific methods.
I could not agree with you more. But Percy is suggesting is we're going in the wrong direction so that there are way more people who can't mediate or ameliorate that split. Do you know what I mean? And what he's trying to do is say, well, here are some of the reasons, but a lot of them are just fundamentally us, right? Humans. And as we move forward for next week, and you know, you got to read a chunk. Let's see if you can do July, what is it? July 1st. Is that right? Yeah. Because what we're going to sort of look at and watch how many ways Percy is also taking us all the way back to Genesis. What's the name of this machine he has?
Absolutely, taxometer.
So what's the connection?
Relapse.
Yeah, it you know, pre-lapsarian, post-lapsarian, that's the fall of mankind. Where does he live? Paradise. Yeah. Only it has, you know, gates and yeah, guards, which is so interesting. And then he has this first marriage. The thing about Tom Moore that I want you to keep your eye on, and I think we're actually on the same page, is that despite all of the show that is Tom Moore, this is someone who lost the child he adored. And that matters. Yes? Grief in this novel is extremely important. And he also has this first wife, right? Doris. And he keeps sort of doing these kind of intellectual gymnastics, going, oh, you know, this is connected to the Greek goddess of blah, blah, blah. And really, what he's doing is that very Miltonian trying to explain the ways of God to humans in a way that maybe we talk about it or could understand it in a late 20th, now 21st century. There's a lot going on. So next week, you're going to have to explain the whole woman thing to me. I have ideas. Do you like the book? Just keep going.
It's hard to handle on Tom Moore is Percy is a diagnostician.
Yes.
And he doesn't think there's any one theory that explains everything.
Yes.
And so he tries this one off and he says, but that doesn't work. And so he goes to the other extreme and he tries that on and he says, but that doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so you're like back and forth.
Yeah.
I mean, the Cartesian split is a big deal.
Yes.
He says, ever since soul got rendered from spirit,
yes,
from mind, that means we've been trying to put it back together again.
Well, and I'll write this down so I try to remember. When he talks about himself as a genius, in the transcendental philosophy of Emerson, writes this whole essay about how a real genius is able to mend that split. And Tom doesn't seem to be in that space, but we generally think of a genius as someone who can, you know, build a machine to fix the universe. And really what Emerson says is a genius is someone who can mend that, you know, split and become a transparent eyeball. It's all very transcendental. We should do some transcendentalists sometime. And let's always remember, Guy picked this book. All right, you guys, go have a week. Be careful.
Trying to get.
Oh, you.
I